There's nothing quite like No More Heroes. The series' first installment flashed enormous potential at times, both as an action game and as an irreverent, self-aware critique of the traditional hero arc that often revelled in testing the limits of its unpalatable protagonist. The main criteria for success for any follow-up, therefore, was to reproduce this potential more consistently. This certainly was the attitude with which I approached Desperate Struggle, and the standard against which I think a critique of any sequel should be judged, especially to a game that showed such promise. It is, however, important to note that this exists separately to the quality of life improvements and systematic refinements that the first game so desperately needed, which I would nonetheless consider secondary for the series to truly fulfill its promise. This distinction was my primary analytical framework when I began No More Heroes 2, and is a distinction that I think is very valuable when considering just how successful this sequel is. The original No More Heroes offered simple but flashy combat action, tied together by incisive motion input from the Wiimote in the form of finishing blows, simultaneous clashes, and professional wrestling-inspired grapples, all of which I considered to be a crucial and enjoyable way of harnessing the peculiarities of the Wii's unorthodox control methods. As is a running theme with most of No More Heroes 2, many of the game's combat systems are now streamlined. From the heads-up display, the stance indicator has been removed entirely, likely because this system only became engaging in one-on-one, close combat face-offs, where it was used to circumvent the enemy's guarding pose. Now, No More Heroes 2 chooses to integrate a fast and strong attack system based on the player's high or low Wii Remote positioning, but with no explicit heads-up display integration. Next, it greatly reduces the size of the beamed katana's charge gauge, opting for a more euphemistic representation of Travis's weapons enthusiasm for battle. On top of this, some of the visual spectacle on screen when dispatching enemies has been reduced by the removal of the concentric pulsing and electrical surges that occurred upon enemy deaths, which are replaced by a rather more gruesome, bloody exhibition. Contrast this with this. The final and perhaps most mechanically consequential addition to this area of the game is the reworking of the ecstasy gauge. Instead of our friendly tiger simply acting as a representation of the remaining usage time for a slot machine power-up, players can now charge the gauge with successive strikes on an enemy without taking damage themselves. When the gauge is full, a devastating super mode can then be unleashed. Now we've discussed the changes to be found in No More Heroes 2, there are a few irritations related to the combat system, which haven't been ameliorated since the first game, or have cropped up for the first time now. First, due to the idiosyncrasies of the Wii Remote, there is no way to easily and freely control the camera, a problem that manifests itself in certain environments, but whose limitations can be effectively challenging in others. Second, the game chooses not to explain, elucidate, or tutorialize some of its more advanced mechanics. And although the game is certainly not impossible without these techniques, it can be disappointing to complete the game only to then learn of their existence, or to be forced to turn to external or online recourse, just to learn some of the game's systems. A final area that is less significant is how little the game does to help or encourage players to check their combat stats or health bonuses which are gained in free time between missions, though admittedly this is part of a larger problem that we'll touch on later. Now that we're aware of these changes and mild irritations, this slightly altered toolkit remains quite simple. This simplicity is not inherently positive or negative. What the first game gained through novelty and spectacle has, due to the passage of time, and because of some changes, ebbed away. This simplicity has forced a shift of focus, both visually and mechanically, onto the opponent. Desperate Struggle, therefore, must pin its hopes on the more extrinsic elements of its combat design, the quality and thought put into its bosses, levels, and standard enemies. As noted with the previous entry in the series, a particular issue for this combat system was a struggle to scale itself between the non-boss action sequences and the bosses themselves. Desperate Struggle tries to ameliorate this problem by introducing a much wider variety of enemies. And although on paper this is clearly an improvement, I want to discuss how it could be even better. Broadly speaking, there is a hierarchy of gameplay design competency. Enemy variety is an important tool to ascend this hierarchy, but I believe those games at the very top demonstrate a mastery of a concept I refer to as gameplay direction, the meaning of which I will try to explain now. Speaking theoretically, increased enemy variety can improve any game by involving or evoking straightforward visual and mechanical novelty. In other words, certain enemies are interesting to inspect and examine as they move and interact with their environment. Certain enemies may move faster, dodge your attacks, or have more health. These inherent properties of the enemy force players to tackle them differently, even in isolation. A game that does this, and this alone, has perhaps the weakest grasp of gameplay direction. This is when enemies and their placement and combination does little or nothing to work harmoniously with each other, as well as with other elements of the game. A more proficient level of gameplay direction is achieved when enemy types or classes are used in combination with one another, encouraging the player to create priorities, manage resources, and navigate their environment to effectively and efficiently dispose of these enemies. For example, ranged enemies in No More Heroes 2 pose little threat one-on-one, but when used in combination with larger enemies that take more time to defeat, the threat of these gun-toting baddies can't easily be ignored. The player must eliminate them quickly or make incisive and adventitious attacks on the more threatening enemies when they find themselves briefly behind cover. The highest tier of proficient gameplay direction is exceedingly rare and is only achieved by a subset of even the greatest games. Enemy variety is of course only a small part of this level of proficiency. It occurs when not only are enemy types used in combination, but when they are used to complement one another, as well as level and environment structure, objective design, the game's raw gameplay mechanics, and even factors like narrative climax and soundtrack, all of which can be utilized together with a distinct purpose to draw out a particular way of playing from the player, a distinct rhythm or pattern to tackling obstacles. A concrete definition for this concept is a coherent, well-formed vision for a distinct or unique feeling a creator wishes to elicit from the player by using the game set of gameplay-relevant tools during a specific sequence, level, or group of levels. This concept is perhaps more easily understood through elucidation, and so I want to very briefly mention a few examples of games whose gameplay direction has stood out to me over the years. Housemarque's Super Stardust series' core gameplay theme has always been the struggle to become proactive in tackling mayhem, rather than cowering in its wake. Players learn to take control of a mass of threats and obstacles through brief moments of invulnerability, and by using its weapons offensively and defensively. This game effectively teaches the player to bring order to chaos and engage the overwhelming without fear. An entire genre of games that are based on a very real human phenomenon are strategy games. Strategy games are particularly useful examples because often more action-oriented games find themselves too reliant on a raw franticness or sense of urgency or emergency as the core of their gameplay direction. Take this level from Fire Emblem Fates Conquest, for example. Notice how its map design closes off escape routes and limits the degree of mobility of players' units. How the objective to last a specific number of turns necessitates that the player cannot make risky maneuvers to achieve a win condition. How incessant enemy spawns flank and encircle the player's troops. And how the extra tools dotted about the map, when utilised correctly, encourage the player not to stray too far from the small advantage they grant. All of these factors are extremely effective in evoking a siege mentality, wherein the player must hunker down, dig in their heels, and withstand the onslaught until reinforcements can arrive. Another excellent example is the final level from Fire Emblem Awakening, that plays out as the last push, armed with the knowledge that this is the chance the player has waited for to finally dispatch their nemesis. This contextual desperation alone demonstrates how narrative cues can contribute to gameplay direction. Notice the narrowness of the map and how it funnels the player towards the enemy. How the enemies that spawn to the sides prevent the player from creating a phalanx and moving slowly towards the goal, because they force the player to endure so much residual damage that their resources, both mental and tangible, will be exhausted by the time they reach the boss and may find themselves too weakened to defeat him. The player's only choice is to make a mad, desperate and hopeful charge and pray that the strength of their conviction, the benefit of their experience and the sharpness of their wits will stand to them when it matters. It's important to note that these aren't small decisions made on the fly. These are broad, far-reaching influences. They dictate what the player will feel as they engage with any problems they're faced with. They're a wide ethos on how a level or sequence is to be tackled. A final example of a game with a strong and clear sense of gameplay direction as I've defined it is Doom 2016. Whose gameplay systems, particularly the gore kill mechanic in combination with level verticality and character mobility, inspire players into a distinct pattern of perpetual movement as they search for the correct balance of aggression and trepidation during encounters that is necessitated by the need to replenish health and ammunition in the face of overwhelming numbers. It goes without saying that an exquisite amount of synergy between any game's systems is needed to achieve such a strong grip of gameplay direction. And often for a game like Doom, this gameplay direction doesn't change. One of the most common criticisms leveled at the game. I attribute this to the fact that the game's raw tools and mechanics become so specified to achieve this particular feeling that they become inflexible. In other words, they are so specifically crafted to help elicit and evoke a very precise response that they cannot do much else. This is where the simplicity of a game's tools can be an advantage, and this is how we tie back neatly into No More Heroes 2 and its relatively straightforward combat toolkit. With all this information in mind, we can inspect No More Heroes 2's gameplay more critically to see how well it succeeds in its gameplay direction. Let's look at the two areas where the combat system is utilized: bosses and non-boss action sequences, beginning with the latter. In theory, No More Heroes tools, which have always been oriented for one-on-one encounters, should take great advantage of the aforementioned increased enemy variety, to grant the combat an opportunity to shine more regularly in its non-boss action sequences, which I will now call NBAs. In practice, however, as seems to be a running theme with No More Heroes 2, many of these refinements are refinements without a vision or direction. They are refinements for the sake of refinement. Very rarely does No More Heroes 2 harness this increased enemy variety in such a way to actually create a bare-bones strategic layer to the proceedings. This should be contrasted with the first game, which never demanded any strategic input from players at all. It did, however, incorporate significant novel and original mini-games into its NBAs, which successfully added a dash of colour to the proceedings, but are noticeably absent from No More Heroes 2. Perhaps the most problematic issue here is the reuse of the same level objective, which is recycled throughout the entire game and ensures that a very familiar rhythm is quickly established for each NBA, the only variety arising from how many waves of enemies spawn before the area is in fact cleared and the player can move on. This broad analysis is applicable for the majority of the game's NBAs. Some are shorter and thankfully more to the point, while others feel more bloated, where the banality and lack of novelty becomes more obvious and tedious, where a lack of checkpoints becomes more clear, and the levels devolve into a process of farming power-ups or ecstasy gauge just to clear the area faster. Without spoiling too much, there are some levels which become quite repugnant due to a poorly conceived level layout that falls foul of the limited camera controls, but luckily these are few and become obvious when the player reaches these areas. On the whole, despite some changes and what appears to be an attempt to make improvements in this facet of the game, these efforts aren't quite as successful as I hoped. And by removing the surprises of the original game, it's arguable that there is, on the whole, a net decrease in what enjoyment can be gleaned in this area compared to its predecessor. Now that we've examined what has traditionally been the weakest element of the No More Heroes series, let's take a look at its strongest. We've discussed above how gameplay direction applies to No More Heroes' non-boss action sequences, but is the same conceptual framework even applicable to boss encounters? It's clear what a weaker boss battle does. It offers little challenge, does little to excite, and doesn't last long in the memory. These three broad requirements that emerge to be challenging, memorable, and thrilling can all overlap or exist separately, and it seems reasonable to say that a battle that is successful evokes more than one of these principles. But what can make the player engage with the boss in a way that evokes a distinct, unique feeling? Is it even possible? And is it necessary for a really great boss encounter to cross some threshold, the way I believe it is for straightforward linear gameplay? In order to answer these questions, the first thing worth considering is that there is little to no objective variety within the confines of a boss encounter. There is only a health bar to be depleted, which, when done, will prompt victory for the player. As a result, instead of asking how we engage with levels and the elements therein, the question evolves into how we engage with this single entity within their environment. It changes from situational feelings, i.e. what the player feels when they're in a certain position or dilemma, and instead morphs into concrete feelings within a more antagonistic context. This includes fending off an incessant and relentless enemy who is frenetic and indefatigable, or even the last gasp of life as you try to topple your final foe in sheer exhaustion. With this in mind, we can satisfactorily alter our definition of successful gameplay direction for boss encounters as a coherent, well-formed vision for a distinct or unique feeling a creator wishes to elicit from the player by using the game's set of gameplay relevant tools that relates to a specifically adversarial context. So, now we have our slightly altered criteria in place, let's briefly become cardiologists and dissect the heart of No More Heroes 2. Although I want to try and remain vague and not spoil too many of the boss encounters of the game, as I discuss them, I feel it is an inevitability I will become fairly detailed, and I believe this detail is an efficient way of illustrating the broader themes of this review. Nonetheless, I will endeavour for the sake of brevity to direct this discussion without revealing too much. There are 10 boss encounters in No More Heroes 2, and for each I will briefly describe where they fall on the spectrum of successful gameplay direction and why, as well as any deeper analysis I believe is necessary. On a broad note, the first thing to mention is that the latter portion of this 10 is much stronger. The game increases in quality significantly as the game reaches its narrative crescendo. The result of this, therefore, is that many of the initial boss skirmishes are relatively uninspiring, whether because they are simple intro encounters, they fail to challenge the player, or because they have little worth remarking upon. Of these 10 encounters, 2 fail for technical reasons, despite their conceptual novelty. The game's camera controls, or lack thereof, become distinctly at odds with the arena layout of both. The latter of which becomes so repugnant and infuriating that it borders on unplayable, especially by modern standards. These are the absolute low points of No More Heroes 2, and from here there is only improvement. 3 of the 10 encounters are highly memorable for their sheer circumstantial novelty and surprise factor, despite posing little challenge. However, as the game wears on, we see a significant increment in difficulty, and towards the end, No More Heroes 2 establishes a great rhythm with its boss encounters, and we move into its strongest run of battles, the top 4. The first of which deserves a good bit of in-depth analysis, because I believe it represents an excellent example of masterful gameplay direction. It's easy to see how this battle excels when examining its constituents. A frantic musical backdrop complements fast and frenetic character movement, which is set in beautiful visual contrast to the still, nighttime building top arena, while the moon peers down from above as the sole spectator of the conflict unfolding below it. However, we begin to get a grasp of just how special this encounter is when we start to engage with our enemy mechanically, and it becomes clear just how we need to interact with this character. Her large, powerful weapon that knocks Travis to the ground, the only time this mechanic feels consequentially implemented in the game, and high fire rate makes chasing her down a nightmare. She flees quickly, and the long sightlines of the arena means getting near enough to corner her is more than half the battle. Even when you get close enough to finally attack, the challenge becomes a balancing act of evading her melee attacks without granting her an opening to escape and recommence your chase, thus handing her back advantage at long range. This encounter encapsulates the distinct adversarial strategy of something that is desperate to keep you away at all costs, a character who is perpetually trying to keep you at arm's length, and who knows what its strengths are and how to utilize them. On top of this, there's something thematically appropriate about this character being a famous music idol, with the metaphorical distance between the life of a normal person and someone with that amount of fame that is somehow brilliantly reflected in the gameplay direction of this encounter. In my review for No More Heroes 1, I singled out an encounter like this that I also considered remarkable. This battle in desperate struggle stands as a mechanical mirror to that encounter in terms of gameplay direction. In the first No More Heroes, the encounter revolved around an entity who is so volatile and explosive, the player must carefully extract what they want from it before it blows up. Rather than being attracted to it as you are in No More Heroes 2, you're repelled by it. You're sickened by her thematic realization. Her variety of attacks and movement patterns are limited in range but vicious and unpredictable. As a result, players must very carefully approach her so as not to cause the enemy to lash out too much. There's a sense in which the goal is to keep her away from you at all times, but the player must still come close enough to hit her. Thematically, this provocatively dressed but disgusting creature embodies both an element of attraction and repulsion at the same time, which is also brilliantly reflected in how the player interacts with the boss itself. It's fair to say that these two examples represent the core of the series of No More Heroes. There are few games that I can think of that reach the heights of these two exemplary cases of boss-centered action gameplay, and they both stand tall as some of the most compelling sequences that I've experienced in gaming ever. High praise indeed. Although the final three encounters of No More Heroes 2 don't reach quite these lofty echelons, they still attain a distinct level of fun due to their challenge, personality, uniqueness, and sometimes because of just how infuriating they can become. Rank 3 presents a remarkably unique concept and environment design. Rank 2 tests players for a very real and complete understanding of the game's combat tools, and the final boss of the game, even if its difficulty does begin to blur the lines between challenging and game-breaking. If the player has the patience to persevere, the sheer difficulty ensures an extremely strong sense of climax to the game. In their entirety, these boss encounters represent a real upgrade in consistent quality over the original No More Heroes. There are a few more changes that No More Heroes 2 makes to its predecessor, though it's not clear whether these are necessarily improvements or not. The first group of these changes are those made to the open world, which is in fact totally removed, as is the economy system that existed in the previous game. Instead of money being used to enter the next ranked battle, currency can now be seen purely as a disposable income that can be used to purchase new outfits and weapons or exchanged for training. As a result of this part of the game being diminished in size, the side activities that were such a joy in the previous game are also significantly altered, changed to small, 8-bit inspired minigames. Although it's arguable that these are in fact better games per se, for the role they fulfill in No More Heroes itself, they are nowhere near as entertaining as the fully fleshed out, but simple and over-the-top activities of the original game, which I believe fitted much better as a respite between the more intense action sequences. While these new minigames are interesting and visually well realised, it goes without saying that I preferred the silliness of the first game by leaps and bounds. Although it has never been one of the main attractions to the series, the final aspect of No More Heroes 2 worth considering is the framing story that ties the game together. Particularly notable is how it manages to keep the game unpredictable, with its character inclusions, mechanical switches, and novel boss concepts. Moreover, the game's narrative ties quite interestingly into the overarching theme in the creation of the game itself, hints of which can be seen in its odd open world and the noticeable change of position from the series' initial creator, Suda51. The game begins with a somewhat poignant quote.
The assassin's underworld has become a commodity, a chance for profit and entertainment for the masses.
And with this in mind, we can see how each boss embodies some facet of the entertainment industry whether genres of film, music, or broader storytelling. All of this can provide a good deal of interest for those players willing to dive a bit deeper to see how the game's somewhat convoluted story reflects the complicated development of desperate struggle. On paper, there is still a lot of potential to be realised by No More Heroes as a series, and despite some improvements, No More Heroes 2 remains a game in which wading through its shallower, weaker areas is necessary to enjoy its stellar moments. Nonetheless, the further I made my way into Desperate Struggle, and the more the broad themes of this review became clear, that is to say, the pitfalls of refining and solidifying a core concept, the more I realised the consistency I craved when approaching the game initially became an increasingly unrealistic ask. If not in practical terms, then at least philosophically. After all, gruesomeness is a large part of this series' identity. With Travis, the player must learn to separate the wickedness from the virtue. So it stands to reason that perhaps No More Heroes' imperfections only help the player appreciate its high points even more.